Do not think that I have come to abolish the law or the prophets. I have come not to abolish, but to fulfill. This verse has shaped Christian theology for centuries. But what did Jesus really mean? And did he even really say it? If we look at Matthew 5, it's basically understood in two ways. The one group says that what Jesus meant is that he came to fulfill the law for us. We can't, we're just too broken. So he came to fulfill the law for us so we don't have to. The other group says no. Jesus clearly says we should keep on following the rules and regulations in the Old Testament. So which one is it? In this video, I'm going to show you that both views are wrong. And I'm going to show you what Jesus really taught about the law. We're going to look at Matthew 5 because that's the verse or the verses that we think about when we talk about what Jesus taught about the law. Was Jesus this Jewish prophet that followed the Torah himself? Or was he someone that taught something radically different? Now let's have a look at Matthew 5, verses 17 to 19. Do not think that I have come to abolish the law or the prophets. I have come not to abolish, but to fulfill. For truly I tell you, until heaven and earth pass away, not one letter, not one stroke of a letter will pass from the law until all is accomplished. Therefore, whoever breaks one of the least of these commandments and teaches others to do the same will be called least in the kingdom of God. But whoever does them and teaches them will be called great in the kingdom of heaven. Okay, so right away, if we look at what Jesus says according to the Gospel of Matthew, then the idea that Jesus came to fulfill the law and we don't need to follow the rules and regulations in the Old Testament anymore is wrong, because it clearly says, until heaven and earth pass away, not one letter should fall away, and we should teach others to follow the rules and regulations in the Torah, in the Hebrew Bible. Now, also for both views, there's a problem. The idea that it's this perfect law, for the group that says it's this perfect law, we just can't keep it, so Jesus had to come and fulfill the law for us. And the other group that says it's this perfect law that we must keep on following, and we shouldn't take one letter away. For both of these views, there's a problem. The problem is the law is not perfect. It's not that the law is perfect and we are too broken to follow it. The problem is that the law is broken. The law is not good. If we look at the laws in the Torah, the Old Testament, then it's about, even in the Ten Commandments, it talks about slavery. You know, do not covet your neighbor's slave. In the Old Testament, slavery is condoned. There's nothing wrong with slavery, and we see rules and regulations regulating slavery. And don't let apologists lie to you. It's not a good type of slavery. There's two different types of slavery, and both are in the Bible, and both of them are terrible. It's the Torah is also about gender inequality. I did a video a while back where we looked at this idea of a biblical marriage, and I showed you that it's based on this idea that it's all about the man, and the woman is actually his property. Rules and regulations in the Old Testament is not all good, and it doesn't mean it's all bad. I would say some of it is divinely inspired, but some of it is simply humans writing more than 2,000 years ago in a society that was even more broken than ours is today. So it's a bit of a hybrid between the two, but we'll get to that in a moment. There are more problems with Matthew 5. Jesus says, don't throw away one letter of the Hebrew Bible, of the Torah. But then a couple of verses later, in verse 38, he says, you know, it's said an eye for an eye. Now, that's not how it should be. It should be turn the other cheek. Now, an eye for an eye, that's in the Torah 3 times in different places. Now, some will say, but Jesus didn't throw away those rules. He just made it more strict. I would disagree, because an eye for an eye, that is justice. Turning the cheek, That's completely different. It's two completely different ideas. It's not that Jesus made it more strict. The one is justice, the other one is love and forgiveness. But even if you want to say, if you really want to think Jesus just made it more strict, that in itself is a big problem. Let's say, for instance, you're driving down the road at 70 kilometers per hour. There's a clear sign that says the speed limit is 80. A police officer pulls you over and says, you were driving 70 kilometers per hour. And that's a problem. And you tell him, but why? The speed limit is 80. And he says to you, yes, but I've decided to make this law more strict. I'm going to make the law, I'm going to decide that it should be 60 kilometers per hour. Is that a good police officer? Is he following the rules of the law and just making it a bit more strict? No, that is not what the law says. And the Jews understood this. In Deuteronomy 4 verse 2 we read, you must neither add anything to what I command you, nor take anything away from it, but keep the commandments of the Lord your God, which I am charging you. So the idea that Jesus kept the Old Testament laws, he just made it more strict. There's that by doing that, he broke the Old Testament laws. There are more problems with Matthew 5. In Matthew 5 verse 22 we read, but I say to you, if you are angry with your brother or sister, you will be liable to judgment. And also, if you say to someone, you fool, you will be liable to the hell of fire. Now, think about that for a moment. Anger is just an emotion. Babies get angry. You get angry at your parents. Parents get angry at their kids. It's just a human emotion. And again, it's not that the law is too perfect. We simply can't keep it. God made us that way. He made us with that emotion. It's what you do with the anger that can be a problem. Not just that, the idea that you can't say to someone, you fool. Now, this is what Jesus says in Matthew 5 verse 22 according to the Gospel of Matthew. But look at what happens in Matthew 23 verse 17. You blind fools. That is what Jesus says to the Pharisees. Now, Jesus, a couple of chapters before, said, if you say to someone, you fool, you are sinning and you deserve to burn in hell. Now, Jesus said, you fools. According to Matthew, Jesus sinned. Now, again, something is not right here. Jesus is contradicting himself. If you want to believe everything in the Gospel of Matthew was the words of Jesus, then Jesus is not sure of what he is saying, because on the one hand he says, if you say to someone, you fool, you sin, but then he goes ahead and he does it himself. Now, what is going on here? What's going on with Matthew 5? I did a video some time ago called Why the Second Donkey in Matthew Matters. And it's about this contradiction in the Gospel of Matthew, where the author added a second donkey to the story because he wanted to link Jesus to an Old Testament prophecy that he actually misunderstood, and he made this embarrassing mistake. But in that video, he basically, I showed you that there's a pattern. There's a pattern in the Gospel of Matthew where Matthew links Jesus to the Old Testament, to prophecies and to Scripture, and he goes too far. He makes a mistake. You see, the Gospel of Matthew was written by a Jew for a Jewish audience. And for them it was important that Jesus was this Jewish prophet that kept the Torah. But that is not really what happened. In that video, I gave you evidence to show you that the authors of the Gospels didn't know Jesus personally, and they sometimes changed what Jesus said. And I gave you evidence of that. If you want to look at that video, I'll leave a link in the description below. There's also another video I did about thousands of variants, one question, what did Jesus really say? And what I showed you there was that the problem that the authors changed the words of Jesus, that's one problem. The other problem is that the people copying the manuscripts sometimes made changes. And we have proof of that. We can see that some manuscripts that we have been changed. That's why some of the newer translations of the Bible there are verses missing because they know that that's not things that Jesus really said. It was things that was added centuries later. And in that video, I also explained to you that we don't know about all these changes. So when we look at Matthew 5, we need to ask ourselves, is this really something that Jesus said? Biblical scholars also use methods to try and determine whether Jesus really said something. One of the methods they use is called criterion of dissimilarity. And what that is they look at something that Jesus said and then they ask themselves, is this something that reflects Jewish Christian concerns? If it is, it's possible that Jesus didn't really say that. If it's something that's radically different, then it's very possible that Jesus actually said it. Now, Matthew 5 fits into that category. The second method, or another method that they use, is called lack of multiple attestation. And what that means is they look at something and they say, do we find this in any other sources, in any of the other Gospels? And in this case, again, no. What's in Matthew 5 is unique to Matthew 5. So if we look at biblical scholars, what they think, then Matthew 5 verses 17 to 19 is very suspect. It's very possible that Jesus did not really say that. We also looked now and we saw that even if you don't have to be a biblical scholar, but just reading the Bible, you will see that there's problems with these verses. But there's also, apart from the internal contradictions, there's external contradictions. If we look at other things that Jesus said in the other Gospels, Jesus actively rejected or interpreted some of the Jewish laws. He did not keep every single letter, nor did he teach his followers to do so. A good example will be the food laws. The Torah is full of rules and regulations about food. In Mark 7, we read that Jesus says, how is it possible that something you eat can make you spiritually unclean? And the author of the Gospel of Mark then clearly states that by saying that, Jesus declared all food clean. Now remember, the Gospel of Mark is our earlier Gospel, more reliable than the Gospel of Matthew. So we can see that Jesus, all the rules and regulations about food in the Torah, and there's a lot, Jesus just threw all that out. Again, what happened with you're not allowed to even throw out one little part of a letter. Another example will be divorce. In Mark 10, there's a discussion between Jesus and his disciples about divorce, and they're talking about Deuteronomy 24, where Moses said you can just give your wife a letter. I did a whole video on that, but what it gets down to is Jesus looks at that and he says, that's not how it was supposed to be from the beginning. So he's not saying, well, that's what's in the Old Testament, let's just make it a bit more strict. He's looking at the Torah, at something that's written in the Torah, and he says, that's not the will of God. Again, it can't be clearer that Jesus did not believe everything in the Old Testament was the perfect law of God. Another example is fasting. In Mark 2 and Thomas 104, it's clear that Jesus ends the practice. Now, I know you will say, but didn't Jesus fast and didn't he teach us to fast? No, he didn't, but that's another video. When he was talking about this, about fasting, he says that you shouldn't mix, new wine should go into new wineskins. You shouldn't mix the old and the new. So what Jesus is saying is that there's these rules and regulations in the Old Testament. Don't try and mix it with what I'm teaching. I'm teaching something new. Don't mix the two. Let's take a look at another example, the Sabbath. Now, we all know this example where Jesus was defending his disciples after the Pharisees were saying that they did not keep the rules of the Sabbath. And then Jesus said to them, the man is not made for Sabbath. Sabbath is made for the man. And what that gets down to is, Jesus says, yes, the Sabbath is important as a principle, that you should take time out to just get away from this world, spend some time with God. But it's not about the rules and regulations. Now, some argue that Jesus did not violate any Sabbath laws, that it was just these oral traditions that the Pharisees were concerned about, as the disciples were simply plucking heads of grain. But that's not really true. In Numbers 15, verses 32 to 36, we read a story about someone being stoned to death because they picked up pieces of wood on the Sabbath, probably just to make some food. In Exodus 16, verse 23 to 29, we read that you're not allowed to bake, boil, or gather food on the Sabbath. So this idea that the Pharisees just came up with this silly rules around the Sabbath is not true. They got their ideas from the Torah, from the Bible. But more importantly, we can see that when Jesus defended his disciples, he gave an example of another law that was broken. He gave the example of David eating the bread that was reserved for the priests. And that's in Leviticus 24, verse 5 to 9. That's where that law is. So Jesus, in defending his disciples breaking this law, he quoted another law that was broken by David. So clearly, Jesus did not believe that all the laws of the Old Testament should be upheld. Jesus prioritized love over legalism. When Jesus was asked which is the greatest commandment, he said, love God and love your neighbor. Now, again, the idea that there are important commands also state that there are commands that are not that important. Let's take the traffic for an example again. If you do prepare for your traffic test and you read the manual and it says, stopping at the stop sign, that's an important law. Keeping to the speed limit, nah, not really that important. Who will keep to the speed limit? Nobody. What does it mean if a law is not important? So the fact that Jesus confirmed there are important laws means he thought there are laws that are less important. When the rich man questioned Jesus about what he should do, Jesus didn't quote a lot of silly rules that we find in the Old Testament. He quoted, don't murder, don't commit adultery, don't steal, just be a decent human being. It's not about following silly rules. It's about doing things that we all know what to do. These things you know to do even if you've never read the Bible. Don't kill, don't steal, don't commit adultery. We all know that is wrong to do. In the Gospel of Thomas, saying 6, we read, his disciples asked him and said to him, do you want us to fast? How should we pray? Should we give to charity? What diet should we observe? Jesus said, don't lie and don't do what you hate, because all things are disclosed before heaven. You see, it's not about following silly rules and regulations. It's about doing what you know is right. It's about being true to who you are. Jesus taught about discernment, not blind obedience to the law. In Thomas 8, we read the story about this fisherman that caught a lot of fish. Then he found this one big fish and decided to keep that fish and let all the small ones go. And according to the parable, that was a wise fisherman. Jesus is talking about discernment. You need to know what is the right thing to do. And he was telling this story to the Jews, and he was telling to them, if he was saying to them, if you want to keep all these little rules and regulations, if you want to try and keep all of it, you will lose all of it. You should decide, you should discern what is important, and you should stick to that. Jesus did not teach blind obedience to the law. What we read in Matthew 5 is not something that the historical Jesus said. Thank you for watching.